When you hear climate change, what comes to mind? It's a buzz phrase that is being tossed around so frequently and the source of a lot of debates. One thing is certain, the impacts are very real, especially for those of us in small island nations. But the good news is our actions can help to make a difference. My name is Andy Liebert and this is Islands on Alert, a podcast where we discuss how climate change has already affected our islands, what's in store for us if the Earth continues to warm, and how we can help to reduce the devastating impacts. Okay, let's get right to the basics. What is climate change actually? Is it a natural process or man-made? What difference does a rise in global temperature of 2 or 3 degrees mean in the grand scheme of things anyway? Is it more than just the sun real hot these days, boy? Can I trust the science behind these predictions? Is it too late to do anything? Most importantly, should I care? Well, there's a short answer to that last question. You should. The title of this episode is 1.5 to Stay Alive, and for many of us in the most vulnerable climate change regions, this is not an exaggeration. For life on our islands to retain any sense of normalcy, 1.5 is the absolute limit in temperature rise we might be able to tolerate. But don't take my word for it. Today I've brought in a very special first guest, someone born and bred in the Caribbean and is now a globally renowned climate scientist, Dr. Adele Thomas. Dr. Thomas is director of the Climate Change Research Center at the University of the Bahamas and a senior research associate at Climate Analytics. She was a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's 6th assessment report, which was just published in August. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us for our very first episode.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm from the Bahamas, born and raised in the Bahamas in Nassau, and I've always been interested in environmental issues. I did my undergraduate in civil engineering, and then when I was going into graduate school, I wanted to focus on sustainable tourism because it's such a big industry in the Caribbean and for small islands in particular. But my graduate advisor said something that changed my whole perspective. She said, "You need to pay attention to climate change. Your island may not even be around in the future for tourism." Just the stark recognition that your home may not be there in the future. Like, could you imagine the Bahamas isn't there in the future or Antigua isn't there in the future? And so I completely shifted from looking at sustainable tourism over to looking at climate change.
Now, Dr. Thomas, did sustainable development give you a sort of good background for your work with climate science?
Yeah, definitely, because tourism is so reliant, on our attractive climate that gets the tourists to come down to our beaches, and our beautiful weather, and all of that is being changed by climate change.
So, Dr. Thomas, I think this would be a good a place as any for me to ask if you could just break down the science of climate change. Why exactly is our Earth warming?
Sure. So climate change, put very simply, is a change in average conditions, such as temperature and rainfall in a region over a long period of time. And so Earth's climate has constantly been changing over time. But what is very significant now is that these changes are happening very rapidly. And these changes have been attributed to human activity. So we're actually causing these changes. So as we use fossil fuels, so gasoline, coal, etc., we emit greenhouse gases, which then exacerbates the greenhouse effect, which is warming the Earth by trapping the sun's energy in the Earth's atmosphere. And these gases are really causing the average global temperature of the atmosphere to increase. And as that global temperature increases, then it causes lots of other changes to our environment, and that's called climate change. So we have changes in levels of rainfall, the oceans become warmer and more acidic. We see changes in how tropical cyclones, which we call hurricanes or typhoons, behave. What we've seen so far in the world is an increase in global average temperature of about 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. And that's when we really began to emit greenhouse gases on a large scale. Now, an increase of 1 degree Celsius may not sound like a lot, but it is having significant impacts all around the world, and particularly for small islands. And some of the impacts that we have already been observing in small islands are sea level rise, which has been causing coastal erosion and flooding. There are already some islands that are permanently flooded and underwater in the Pacific. We've seen changes to those tropical cyclones. So we've seen those hurricanes becoming more intense and causing greater damages. We've seen changes in rainfall patterns, which have led to drought and affect both food and water security. We've seen changes to oceans that have caused coral reef destruction, and they have an impact on biodiversity and fisheries. And so overall, climate change and the human-caused climate change that we have been seeing has had widespread and significant impacts already for small islands on our ecosystems, on our food systems, on human lives, and on our livelihoods such as fisheries and tourism, which are very important for us as small islanders.
So let's break this down a bit. As Dr. Thomas says, the greenhouse gas effect is a natural and necessary process where gases in the Earth's atmosphere trap the sun's heat. These heat-trapping gases are called greenhouse gases. The effect creates the perfect temperature for life on Earth to thrive. However, balance is key. And humans have disrupted this delicate balance by overloading the atmosphere with carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. Now, this increase in carbon dioxide and some other greenhouse gases have caused the Earth's atmosphere to act like a blanket and trap more and more heat. And of course, this has a negative impact on all of us.
So we are causing this on one hand, and on the other hand, we can also stop this by reducing our emissions and getting to net zero emissions.
Now, climate change affects the entire world, but exactly how are small island states particularly at danger?
So Caribbean states and small islands in general are repeatedly recognized as amongst the most vulnerable in the world to climate change. Yeah. Some of those same impacts that you mentioned are what we are already seeing. So sea level rise, which is already causing coastal erosion and flooding, changes to those hurricanes, which is already causing so much destruction. The cost of responding to those hurricanes is so high and really, puts us more in debt and takes away money that we could use for sustainable development purposes. Changes in rainfall that have already caused droughts and have affected food and water security. Changes to the oceans that are affecting important livelihoods such as tourism and fisheries. So we are already seeing all of this wide range of impacts that are already affecting small islands because of climate change.
I want to call attention to a key word that Dr. Thomas keeps repeating: already. There is this common rhetoric that the consequences of climate change will only be felt in the distant future, affecting our children and not us. Dr. Thomas is highlighting that we are already experiencing the impact, and it will only get worse. Now, Dr. Thomas, as you've spoken about, the scientists are saying that we need to limit our temperature rise to this 1.5 degrees. I'm interested in this. Why this number specifically?
So 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is a red line because we are already experiencing significant impacts of climate change at 1 degree of warming. There will be even greater impacts at 1.5 degrees of warming. So it's not like 1.5 degrees of warming is a safe level of warming for small islands. It still presents significant challenges. But the reason why 1.5 degrees is a red line for us is because it is likely that we will still be able to adapt to climate change at 1.5 degrees. If temperatures rise above 1.5 and reach 2 degrees of warming, our ability to adapt actually decreases, and we may face impacts of climate change that are irreversible. So I think the perfect example of the differences between 1 degree of warming, which is where we're currently at, 1.5 degrees of warming, which is where we want to limit temperatures, and 2 degrees, which is what we don't want to reach, is coral reefs. So at current levels of warming, 1 degree, we are already seeing declines in coral reefs as the oceans become warmer and more acidic. At 1.5 degrees, it is projected that between 70 to 90% of coral reefs will be at risk to decline, which is quite a lot and very alarming. But at 2 degrees of warming, it is projected that 99%, which is virtually all coral reefs, are at risk of long-term decline. And just using coral reefs as an example, coral reefs are incredibly important for biodiversity in the ocean. It supports fisheries. It protects us from when hurricanes come in and those waves. If you can imagine that there are no more coral reefs, then what would the impacts be on small islands? The difference between 1.5 and 2 is really an existential one for small islands.
Wow, it really is, You said that the ocean is becoming acidic. Now, what does this mean, and how exactly does the Earth warming cause this sort of phenomena?
As we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the ocean actually absorbs that carbon dioxide, some of it. And so increased levels of carbon dioxide in the ocean means that the ocean is more acidic, which has implications for coral reefs. It has implications for biodiversity that's in the water. It has implications for commercially important fish. It has implications in the Bahamas. We eat conch, and so the conch shells will not be able to grow to the extent that they have been before because the ocean is too acidic for them. So all of these impacts are related, and it really highlights that climate change affects every aspect of life.
Answer me this, Dr. Thomas. Why is biodiversity important now to the existence of human life?
It's all interconnected. So we depend on ecosystems, both for the direct benefits that they provide, clean air, water, food, when you think about agriculture, fish, seafood, all of that, we depend on biodiversity. And biodiversity on both the land and in the oceans is being negatively affected by climate change. So, some people think climate change is just an environmental issue. It's only affecting plants or it's only affecting animals. But we rely so heavily on plants and animals and on nature in general that any impact on biodiversity also affects us.
And we just don't depend on the plants and animals that we directly interact with, but the entire ecosystem in which those plants and animals also thrive. For example, my favorite type of fish is zebrafish, or what we know as old wife. Nothing beats a well-fried old wife next to some rice and beans and ground provisions. But in order for me to continue to eat that delicious meal, the old wife must be able to get to the proper fleshy size. That's the way I like it. My dinner does not just depend on this fish, but on the invertebrates like sea urchins that the old wife eats. And the sea urchin must be able to find enough zooplankton, kelp, algae, and periwinkles to eat. Sea urchins are apparently not very picky. Zooplankton has to find enough phytoplankton, which must be in the right environment to undergo photosynthesis. You get the idea. This is why biodiversity is so important. If climate change causes the depletion of just one of those species, it disrupts the intricate marine food web and, more importantly, prevents me from biting into my favorite meal. Not good.
I think what helps people who feel removed from climate change is thinking about those extreme events, those hurricanes and those typhoons. And we have seen them become more intense. We have seen the impacts of these hurricanes, and they are only going to get worse.
Now, Dr. Thomas, I want to talk a little bit about the hurricanes and cyclones. Now, there are communities in Barbuda, and I'm from the island nation of Antigua and Barbuda. The sister island Barbuda is still recovering from the impacts of Irma back in 2017. Now, the last hurricane season, there were over 30 storms. That's 30. 19 hurricanes. That's the highest on record. So it's no longer anecdotal that these storms are getting worse and more frequent, and it is absolutely correlated with climate change. Then there was the granddaddy of them all, Hurricane Dorian in 2019, and I know you specifically can relate to this. With both your scientist hat on, and as someone who was on the ground and a witness to this terrifying event, can you go into why Dorian was such an exception and why it may not be so much an exception going forward?
Yeah, so Hurricane Dorian was an incredibly sobering experience to go through.
Yeah.
I write and theorize about how, more intense storms as a result of climate change may affect small islands in the future, but actually seeing that play out at home was incredibly sobering. So Hurricane Dorian hits the northern islands of the Bahamas, Abaco and Grand Bahama. We are an archipelago, and so those are two of our most developed islands. And just seeing the level of destruction that it caused was alarming. It actually completely flattened my grandparents' home. The home is no longer there. There is no longer any structure there. So it really hit home. I'm based in New Providence, and the thousands of people that were displaced from their home that had to come to New Providence, that were looking for some place to live, that were looking for a job, and we just simply could not accommodate all of them. So it was sad. Dorian was really an example of the type of hurricane that we can expect in the future due to climate change. So it had very strong winds, which were well above the threshold for a Category 5. It had a very high storm surge, over 30 feet or 9 meters. So people were flooded out of their homes and had to hold onto trees to avoid being swept away. Very high rainfall, and it moved very slowly. And so it concentrated that destruction as it moved along. And just the human suffering and trauma, people who were directly in that storm and the trauma that they went through, but they could only talk about that. Where even now, if it's a stormy day and they are afraid, I think that lives on well beyond the storm. And it is unfortunately a reality that is facing us as these storms become more intense.
Now, it's absolutely frightening to say the least that these storms are getting more frequent and more intense. Yet there are still skeptics among us who deny that climate change is happening, or that it is happening, but it is completely natural and not caused by humans. So there seems to be an anti-science streak in general, and it's everywhere. Even worse now during, this COVID era. So how do you address these skeptics?
It's still surprising to me that there are skeptics, given the impacts that we are already experiencing and seeing. But when I encounter skeptics, I make it clear that the science is absolutely definitive that climate change is happening and that it is caused by human activities. It is no longer a debate. The science is clear. We have increasing evidence that has allowed us to have better projections over time. We are actually measuring how things are changing now. The person on the street can feel the different impacts that we are experiencing for small islanders as it relates to hurricanes. And so there's no longer a debate. The scientific consensus is very clear. I think that people that want to be skeptics don't want to listen to anyone. So despite the overwhelming evidence, if you just have it in your head that you don't want to believe this, and there's nothing that I can do for that. So I have moved on to now saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? Because the science is absolutely clear that this is happening.
My question is now, what are we going to do about it? And are we too late?
We are not too late. It's absolutely not too late to limit global warming. It is just critical that we act now. This is to meet the 1.5 degree temperature goal. So whether Earth can stay within 1.5 degrees of warming involves two different questions. First is it physically, technically, and economically feasible for us to remain within 1.5? And the science indicates that the answer is yes. It is still quite possible for us to meet 1.5 degrees of warming. The second question is whether governments, the private sector, we as individuals will take sufficient action to limit temperatures. And the answer to this largely depends on the ambition of governments and on political will. So scientifically speaking, we can still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but political action and will determine whether we actually keep temperatures to that limit. And so my work looks at all of that. As part of the IPCC's 1.5 report, we looked extensively at the emissions reductions that would be required to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And we found that it's feasible, but it would require that by 2030, so in about 10 years from now, we have halved our emissions. So we've cut our emissions by 50%. Which is a very ambitious goal, but it is still possible. So the next 10 years are really crucial, and governments really need to focus on getting their emissions cut in half by 2030 and completely to zero by 2050. So there's still time, but we just need to act now.
Okay, so Dr. Thomas, we have to act now. That's clear. What can persons like myself do? What can everyone do at the individual level?
So I think there are three major things that at the individual level you can do. First, I think we need to hold our leaders accountable to ensuring that everything is done at the global scale to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We as small islanders cannot do it ourselves. We need a global commitment to this, and our leaders are so important in pushing for ambition to make sure that this happens. Secondly, I think we also need to have accountability at home in our countries to make sure that we are adapting to the impacts of climate change. We cannot continue with business as usual and think that climate change doesn't exist. We have to make sure that in every decision, we are taking the potential impacts and risks of climate change into account. And then at the real individual and household level, we need to think about how we live and how we can reduce our own individual contributions to greenhouse gas. So even though as small islanders, we are amongst the lowest emitters, we still have to do our part individually. So whether that's carpooling, thinking about your meat consumption, thinking about walking, thinking about trips that you may take, we still each have to individually do our own part in combination with there being that global action at the international scale that will actually get temperatures to be limited to 1.5 degrees.
Dr. Thomas, how are you feeling now? Are you confident that there will be change and there will be a sort of global commitment towards this cause?
That is a good question. I wouldn't say that I'm feeling confident, but I am feeling hopeful that the large emitters recognize that global warming is really an issue of life or death for small islands. And it really is an issue of us being able to survive or not. The whole 1.5 to stay alive is incredibly real for small islanders. And so I am hopeful that the global community recognizes that and takes the action that's necessary to keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees.
Well, let me thank you on behalf of everyone. I'm Dr. Thomas here at OASIS. Thank you for the important and powerful work that you've been doing, and wish you all the very best in the future.
Thanks for having me.
So, as we learned today, climate change is very real and caused by us humans. This is a difficult and unsettling thing to wrap our minds around, and it should be. But there is some good news, some light at the end of the tunnel. We have control over this issue, and there's still time to slow down the disastrous effects of climate change. Dr. Thomas is hopeful, and so am I. There are actions that can be taken at the ground level that individuals like you and me can pursue for us to do our part. But rest assured, there's also action being taken at a higher level by governments around the world. Next week, we will introduce you to the Alliance of Small Island States, a diplomatic grouping of island nations from all over the world that have been aggressively fighting for these issues on the UN stage for the last 30 years. See you then. I'm your host for Islands on Alert, Andy Liebert. Islands on Alert is produced by Leila Henry and Louis Price under the Alliance of Small Island States media team. Special thanks to Tashwa James and Bianca Bedu for additional scripting. Join us next time.